son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, a servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore to me on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how Anakim was there with the great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, as the Lord said." Then Joshua blessed him, and he gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. This is the word of the Lord. So Pastor Park's away today, as you might have noticed, and I'm subbing in for him this morning. And this past week's daily Bible reading is from Joshua chapter 13 through 17. And the bulk of these verses are about the distribution of the land of Canaan among the tribes of Israel. And I gotta admit, I do not find the details of the allocation of land personally interesting or relevant to my life, spiritual or otherwise. Maybe you thought that way too. And when I read it a few weeks ago, I probably thought this is probably less interesting than the minutes of my local township meeting, debating the local zoning laws and whether new Wawas ought to be given permission to open up at a very busy intersection. And that, by the way, is not a hypothetical. For the past 5 years, the borough of Phoenixville, where I live, has been engaged in a furious and passionate battle over the location of a Wawa, whether it should be there or not. It's vicious and nasty. I would love to go to those meetings. I think it'd be more exciting than the Game of Thrones, and certainly possibly more exciting than these chapters of Joshua. Exciting stuff. But by comparison, these chapters seem, well, how can I say it without being heretical, dull, bureaucratic, and possibly irrelevant, very distant from our lives. And yet this is the word of the Lord, useful for teaching, rebuking, and correcting in righteousness. And here it is, and we're reading it and talking about it. I think that there are profound, important, encouraging lessons in these chapters. And behind all these details about geography and borders and who gets to live where in a country far, far away, centuries, millennia ago, this is a story about the God who loves and cares deeply about his people. And this is a story that illustrates the way this God loves his people, nurtures them, gently molds them, forms them, and is the way this God remembers them. And this God is profoundly attentive to the important details of their lives. And I want to give some broader context to these chapters and the meaning of the settlement of the land of Canaan. You know this stuff already, probably, but let's just put this in a framework that makes sense. About 600 years before these events, God made a covenant with Abraham. God told Abraham to leave his home, become a nomad, and in return, God would make him a father of a great nation and give his descendants a promised land. And then generations passed with no promised land, at least not yet. As you know, on and on and on, generations passed, and Joseph brought his extended family to Egypt. And for many years, the descendants of Abraham, Joseph, the Jews, they flourished and grew in the land of Egypt. But Egypt was never their home, no matter how prosperous they were, no matter how good their lives were. This was not their home. It was not the promised land. And they were always going to be foreigners, perpetual aliens in the land of Egypt. So eventually a Pharaoh enslaved them, and they suffered terribly. And they were slaves in Egypt between 200 or 400 years, depending on which scholar you ask. Doesn't really matter. Either way, 200, 400 years, that's a really, really long time to suffer under slavery. And for generations, these Jews, these children of the promise, cried out to God, begging, asking, with faith, asking God to make good on this promise to Abraham. They were still in slavery, but waiting and believing that there would be a promised land waiting for them. And eventually, as you know, the Jews were freed from slavery by Moses, by God, of course, but through the hand of through the vehicle of Moses. And of course, God's original plan was for the Jews to take a direct route from Egypt to their promised land, which was the land of Canaan. And the path would have been Egypt through the Red Sea to Sinai, then Canaan, the promised land. And if you look at a map, it's almost a straight line. Well, it's actually kind of a curved line, but it's pretty direct. And when they got to the border of Canaan, God commanded the Jews to conquer the land. And so Moses sent out 12 spies to scope out the land of Canaan. But the spies came back and described a strong and intimidating nation. The report from the spies was basically this in our modern vernacular: we cannot beat them. Those Canaanites, they are strong and scary. They're going to crush us. We're dead meat. This battle, this war is not going to happen. Let's turn around and do something else. This is not going to work out for us. Now, among the 12 spies, there were two exceptions that didn't panic: Joshua, the guy that we're reading about, his book, and a guy named Caleb. And Joshua and Caleb urged everyone to be faithful. This was their basic message in modern vernacular, in summary. Trust God in his promise. God will fight our battles. God will win. We will win. It looks terrible, but have faith in God. It's going to work out because God is God and God is faithful. They urged the people, don't listen, don't be scared, don't melt, just do the right thing, follow God. But the Israelites did not trust God, even after the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. And that was not some legendary or mythological event that might have happened to great-great-great-great-grandpappy that got passed down generation upon generation and got exaggerated over the years. Those events, the parting of the Red Sea, the plagues, that was just 11 months ago. All right? That was less than a year that they experienced these things, and they still did not trust God would deliver them through some miracle to conquer the land of Canaan. And so the Israelites disobeyed and rebelled against God. They refused to enter the land. So then God decreed that wicked and disobedient generation, that rebellious generation, they would not enter the promised land. And instead, they would wander the wilderness near the promised land till all the adults of that generation of Israelites who had left Egypt, who had disobeyed, except for Joshua and Caleb, the faithful spy, they had all died. And so then they would wander the desert for 40 years, led by Moses, and only then could they enter the promised land after they had to go through their trials for what they had done, for what they had rather not done. So the book of Joshua is essentially what happens after the 40 years of the wilderness wandering. And the events described in Joshua is a fulfillment of the promise made 600 years ago to Abraham. This people, God's chosen people, the promised people of the promise, they've been homeless for 600 years, holding on to what God had said, I will give you. And here it is. This is the book, and it is epic. So the book of Joshua is about the God who keeps his promises, the God who is faithful, the God who has a plan. God promised Abraham something, and Abraham never saw this promise fulfilled. And neither did his son Isaac, nor his grandson Jacob, nor his great-grandson David. And on and on and on. It took 600 years from the promised land to Abraham to the conquest of Canaan for this promise of a homeland to come true. It's not hard to imagine that these people who were the children of the promise doubted or gave up hope. Abraham and Sarah certainly did. They were supposed to have children. God promised them. But they were really old and they were barren. So in a moment of weakness, they thought maybe God is not going to come through for us on this. And they're thinking, maybe God forgot about us. We can't really rely on God. We're going to have to do this on our own. So Sarah told Abraham to have a child with Hagar. Well, that didn't turn out well, and that's just a beginning. And we see a pattern developing in the Old Testament. doubting God, now trusting God. It goes on and on and on. The entire biblical narrative of the Israelites from Abraham to the conquest of Canaan could be summarized in this way. This is what I think. I think God forgot about us. God is not faithful. God's a promise breaker. God does not love us. God does not know what he's doing. God does not have any kind of plan. We came to Egypt and now we're slaves. We're stuck in a wilderness. Now we're homeless. We're about to get annihilated by some evil army. We're on our own. We're alone in this hostile, cruel world. Again, God does not care about us. God doesn't have a plan. That seems to be the dominant message, the dominant pattern we see over and over again in Israel's relationship with their God. Regarding the 12 spies who checked out Canaan, we tend to think that Joshua and Caleb are heroes. They're the ones who believed. And the 10 who lost their faith are the villains who doomed the rest of Israel to 40 years of wandering and suffering. And that's true. There are heroes and villains in that story. But I can easily imagine being the 10 who doubted God. I can relate to those 10. I have a hard time relating to the 2 who were faithful. I can imagine having that nagging fear, anxiety, and doubt, the questions that haunt you. Again, does God have a plan? Does God even know what he's doing? It must feel like for them, and for me in my own life, and possibly for you when things are going well, when things are scary, it must feel like you're on a bus and you want to go home, but the bus driver is going all over the place. The bus appears to be going backwards at times, sideways, driving to strange neighborhoods you've never seen before. And the trip home is taking way longer than you think it should, like 600 years longer than you expected. And the worst part is, you're stuck in a bus. The doors are locked, and you can't even get out. So you start wondering, is the bus driver nuts? Is he drunk? Is he insane? Is the bus heading anywhere? Or are we just going in circles? Does the bus driver even know where he's going? So I wonder if that's what it felt like for them. That's certainly what it feels like for me at times in my life. There were 12 spies, 10 who lost faith, 2 who believed. And in our own lives, we can surely sympathize with the 10. I can. Do we believe in God and his goodness? We do believe in those things, of course. But the waiting takes so long. And in the meantime, there are times in our lives when everything seems to be going backwards, sideways, upside down. And I would say 10 out of 12 times when horrible things happen in my life, I doubt. I'm a lot more like the 10 spies who doubted God than the 2 who were faithful. Of course, we see that during those 600 years, it was not God who abandoned the Israelites. It was the Israelites who abandoned God. God didn't waver in his promise or his commitments. It was the Israelites who wavered. And we see in Joshua and this chapter, so like God does come through. He doesn't forget or abandon Israel. He always loved them. He always was attentive. He always had a plan. They just didn't see it. They doubted. I'd like to pivot for a second and think about the issue of the distribution of the land that takes up so much of the chapters assigned this week, and frankly, a lot of the chapters in the book of Joshua. What does it mean? Why is it here? Boring as it is, the most important question is, what does it tell us about God, his character, his nature, and the way he treats us? The Jews were given this land by God. This is their new home. And that is all well and good, but practically, how is that supposed to happen? Just open up the gates and say, can you imagine all the Jews lining up the border of the land, the gun fires, and they all start running in. And, or Joshua says, all right, boys and girls, go wild, just take it. Imagine hundreds of thousands of people just flooding into the land of Canaan and sorting out amongst themselves who owns what and who gets to live where. It would be survival of the fittest, the fastest, the most aggressive, the most obnoxious, the loudest. It would have been brutal and chaotic. I study history. I can tell you for sure, it would have been awful if there was no plan, if they just went into it. The division of the land that seems so boring, so tedious, so bureaucratic, this is just God being God. God is imposing order on the promised land and the homeland. It's a repeated theme we see over and over again in the biblical narrative. And the theme is this: God is a God of order, and God hates chaos. I think it would be fun to go from Genesis 1:1 to the very end of Revelation and trace a theme of order and chaos through the entire biblical story. Now, I'm not going to do that right now, but it is very interesting, and I think it's an eye-opening way to read the Bible. But just think about this for a second. Think about the creation story of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, the world was void and without form. Another way to describe this primordial state of things, void and without form, is chaos. Chaos is like this. Imagine taking a bunch of random things in your kitchen or things from the backyard, and throwing them haphazardly in your food processor. No menu, no measurement, just slap it in there and press a blend button. That would be chaos, as opposed to a careful recipe in which you measure out every ingredient one at a time, down to the precise level, and you put things in very carefully in an order. That would be order. But in the creation story, God enters what would be this chaotic muck, and he begins a process of putting things in the proper order, into the proper and good place. Think about the rest of the story. God separates a day from the night. God separates the land from the water. He separates the sky from the earth. And then he makes a hierarchy. The sun rules the day, the moon and the stars rule the night. And then everything has a proper home. Fish belong in the water. Terrestrial animals on dry land. Birds belong in the proper place, the sky. And then he puts human beings in the middle of it all. And where he puts them is what he calls a cultivated garden. He tells them to manage it, rule it, take care of it. Gardens don't stay gardens on their own. They go wild. So he tells human beings, this is your job. I've made a beautiful garden for you. Now keep it in order and follow me. Be like me. Keep this garden in order. Don't you see the picture of this creation story that's being painted? God enters a formless, chaotic, disordered mess. And then he lovingly, caringly, attentively, wisely imposes order onto their chaos. He puts things into their proper place. And he creates hierarchies and structures. We begin with a problem, random chaos. And God is a solution, which is God's good order. You could look at the entire biblical narrative, the story from beginning to end, as God's work of making good order out of chaos. And he makes creation, it is good and organized. And then Satan wrecks it, messes it up. He messes up God's good order by contaminating and corrupting it with sin and chaos and disorder. And the work of God is a gradual, revolutionary work of restoring order to the mess that sin is making in the world. And the division of the land described in Joshua is another example of simply God doing his good organizing work, creating structure, creating societies, creating divisions, telling places, this is your place, and I'm going to put you here, I'm going to put you here, I'm going to put you here. And on top of that, there are going to be laws that govern your world, turn you into degenerating into chaos. God loved Adam and Eve so much, he put them in a garden, not a wild wilderness. God loves the Israelites so much, he's not just giving them a homeland. He's organizing their homeland, turning what could be chaos into order. And as we are prone to sin, we are prone to chaos, and in our own lives, God is fixing our interior lives, God's fixing our families, and God's fixing our communities by making them ordered, not chaotic. Augustine, arguably the most intelligent Christian who ever lived, said the essence of sin is, quote, disordered love, end quote. I think about it all the time. I think it's a profoundly meaningful and interesting way of thinking about the nature of sin. It is love, but it is disordered love, meaning we love less important things too much, and we don't love the important things enough. Or we even love the right things, but our love for the right things becomes twisted, distorted, and contaminated. Let me just give you one really quick example for, some of you, a lot of you. If you're parents, you love your kids. Of course we love our kids. Great. It'd be wrong and sinful not to love your kids. But your love for your kids could turn your kids into an object of idolatry and a vehicle of your own ambition and dreams. It's possible if you're not careful. It'll be easy to love your kids into a great college, into a prestigious profession, into the right marriage because you love them so much. But your love may end up crushing them and alienating them and making them hate you. It's love for sure, okay? It's not hate, it's love, but it's a disordered love. It's a chaotic love. It's not put in its proper place. But that's another sermon. No time for that right now. This is spiritual growth and maturity. God enters the chaos of our lives and our disordered loves, and he orders them in the proper way. It's a lifelong evolution. God is changing us, turning us from chaos into order. I want to shift gears a bit now. I want to think about Caleb again. Except for Joshua and Caleb, everyone lost their faith. And so for 40 years, the Israelites would have to wander the wasteland. Now I'm trying to put myself in Caleb's head. Caleb's reward for being faithful is that during those 40 years, his entire generation would die off and not enter the land. But Caleb would live long enough to enter the land. And for being faithful, he'd get a chunk of land. But only after 40 years of wandering. And during those 40 years, did Caleb ever doubt? Did he ever wonder if God would remember him? Or maybe he might have thought, if in the important work of creating a nation of priests, of creating Israel, which will be a vehicle of ushering in Messiah, and of reconciling the human race and the entirety of creation back to himself, will God remember little Caleb was faithful on that one day that God promised Caleb a little plot of land? I mean, for me, I'd probably doubt. I'd be worried that God would forget about me, and I'd probably console myself this way. You know, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. God's got massively important things to do, cosmic things to do, like managing and saving the universe. So my little one act of faithfulness, my claim to the plot of land, maybe God forgot. God sort of slipped his mind. It's okay. God's got better things to do than remember me. I mean, who am I anyway? I mean, that's actually not hypothetical at all. That's quite literally often what I find myself telling myself when my life doesn't seem to be going my way, when things are going sideways, backwards, upside down. I have to confess, I often, in my moments of weakness, feel forgotten by God. And I think about Caleb. He's important, but is he really, though? I mean, Josh was important, but Caleb, is he important? I mean, he's in the Bible, he's a hero, but what did he do? He screamed at the people and said, "Listen to God," and no one listened. What did he accomplish? Other than being faithful, did he affect any real change? No. I want to tell you something very personal and something I struggle with. I teach for a living. And I think at this point, my students generally like me. I think they like me because I'm funny, I'm entertaining, I'm engaging. And I don't ask myself this question too much because I might get depressed. But I do wonder, do I change them? They listen to me, but do they really listen to me? What difference does it make? For about a year before now, I taught once a month to the youth group. And I preached once a month, and I think they liked me because I'm funny, I'm engaging, I try to be charismatic. And I entertained them for about 20 minutes once a month on Sunday. But I do wonder, and I try not to think about this. I'll get too depressed. But I do wonder, did it make a difference other than the fact that they were maybe kind of not bored for 20 minutes? And so like Caleb, I try to be faithful, but I do wonder, what difference does it make? If you think about that too long, that can be depressing. But think about what Caleb did. In your own life, I think we wonder, do we make a difference in this world? We try to be faithful to God, but does it make a difference? And I'm encouraged by the story. I'm really encouraged by this story because it's not just about the promised land that God gave to Caleb. It's not just a legal real estate transaction. And really, in the grand scheme of things, 5,000 years of human history, wars and conquest, Jesus' salvation, resurrection. What is this? One man who's 85 years old, a couple hundred acres maybe, and his descendants. I mean, the real question here for Caleb and for me, and maybe for you, It was about the nature of God and his relationship with his people. And the land is just emblematic of a larger issue, which is this. Does God remember Caleb? Or how's this? Does God remember me? Does God remember you? Is God mindful of the order of Caleb's life? Or has God ordered the years of Caleb's life? Or is Caleb's life just a chaotic muck that God forgot about, an afterthought, a footnote at best? And I wonder if that was a lingering fear in Caleb's heart. And I confess to you, that's a lingering fear in my heart as I live. Do I matter? Does my work matter? Can I make any change in this world? Does my work matter, or is it just some little tiny thing in God's grand scheme of things? However, when Caleb finally gets to land, it's like God saying, I know you, Caleb. I remember what you did. Your life has a plan. It's part of my plan. Your life may look random, but it's not chaotic. I've ordered your life, and you're not forgotten. And Caleb's important. God loves Caleb. God honors Caleb and gives him that land. Not because he convinced all those Israelites 45 years ago to do the right thing. Because Caleb was faithful to the one thing God asked him to do. It didn't change the world. It didn't make the Jews do what they're supposed to do. But God says, I remember you. I know what you did. I haven't forgotten about you at all. I've been watching you my whole life. Your whole life, I've been watching you. I've been guiding you. I've been attentive to you. Again, this issue is personal for me. There have been moments in my life, and by moments, I mean big chunks, not like a passing afternoon or a couple days, but like years, many years. I mean, not 40 years like Caleb or 600 years like the Jews, but long years. There have been years when I have felt quite strongly that my life was chaos. I mean, I thought I was following God. But no matter how hard I tried, I was getting nowhere. Going backwards, running into walls. Things aren't going to plan. I mean, I had the strong sense that I'm trying really, really hard and doing things to get from here to there. And I felt like I was running on a treadmill. No matter how hard I tried, I'm not getting to where I want to go. Sometimes I'm actually going backwards. The opposite is happening. Things are not going according to plan for long chunks of years. And I remember the sense that I felt powerfully that God forgot about me. Or my life was a series of random things, and I was foolish to think there was any kind of order to it. And the worst part was, I was very prayerful. I was trying to follow God, and things went nowhere, and I felt like an idiot at times. I felt so embarrassed that I was trying to follow God. I felt like this is a colossal mistake. What's going on? I remember my junior year in college, I was reading Martin Heidegger, a 20th century German philosopher. Because, that's what people do in college. Well, that's what I did. And Heidegger, this book really affected me, Being in Time. I remember that moment in the library reading Being in Time, trying to understand this thing. And I finally understood. Heidegger was saying that you're randomly and haphazardly just thrust into the cold and chaotic universe. And the world was not made for you. It wasn't made for anyone. It just is. Again, the image that came to my mind, this is not Martin Heidegger, the image that came to my mind was, you ever see a wood chipper, when you stuff down trees and they just spit it all out? I felt like that was my life. You just took random things, and shoved in some machine, and it just got spit out. It's just chaotic. There's no order. There's no structure. It's just random stuff. Life is, the world just is. You are just is. You don't fit into the world because there's no design. There's no plan. I mean, randomly, you got conceived by your parents, and the chromosomes just got mixed up. And then pop, you come out. Maybe you're born tall, maybe you're born short, athletic, weak. Maybe you're smart, maybe you're dumb. Maybe you're ugly, maybe you're pretty. You got nice parents who are wealthy, stable, or you're born into a broken home. It's just random. It's not fair or unfair. Because to say it's fair suggests that there's an order that's been violated. Heidegger says there's no fair or unfair. It just is. You're just randomly spat into the world. Success or failure, what does that mean anyway? It's just whatever. It just is. And I remember in that library at Yale in my junior year reading Heidegger and thinking, like a eureka moment, this makes sense. This is how I feel about my life. And it's not just those angsty college years that we all go through. I mean, I've gotten less angsty over the time. But even after college, I've often felt this way. When my life is going badly, and there seems to be no plan, no order to anything in my life. I just remember Heidegger, and I think Heidegger's right. No, he's not right, but I feel that way, though. And in those times, I've got Heidegger in one hand, and I've got the Word of God in the other hand. And evidence tells me that Heidegger's right. But by faith, I cling onto the promises of God. I say, no, Heidegger's wrong. No matter how angsty and tortured and chaotic my life feels. In those times, I think about the Bible. I try to read. I think about Psalms 139 and 16 in particular, which I'll paraphrase a lot, but it's still true. I'm just really paraphrasing it. God has ordered all the days of my life, and they are written in his book. But faith, I remind myself that God is not random. God has a plan. God is the author of my life. It's in a book. He's planned it all out. And then I also think about the life of Caleb. And then for decades in the wilderness, Caleb clung on to hope and faith that God remembered him, that God ordered the days of his life, and God was faithful, because that is who God is. And that's what God does. He brings order into your chaos. He has a plan, and God remembers you, even if it takes decades of wandering in the wilderness where you feel like you're going nowhere. And even if all those decades you feel like, my work, how's faithful, and it made no difference in the world. It doesn't matter, actually. I mean, it matters, but what really matters is that God remembers you, and God saw what you did, and God honors you for your obedience. So this is what these chapters of Joshua are about. Again, it may seem like God has forgotten you, and your life is a mess. You may feel like you're on a bus, that the driver's drunk, and to drive you off a cliff. But the truth is, God knows, God remembers, and God wants to save your life and turn the chaos into order. Well, I was supposed to pray. Forgot that. Still new at this. Lord, we thank you